Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to look at verses 17 through 31. We're still in that litany or list of heroes of the faith. And we looked at Abraham, and before that we looked at Abel and Enoch and Noah. And we're going to look a little bit more at Abraham, and then the rest of the patriarchs, and then Moses, and a couple of more instances. And then the author of Hebrews will kind of save us, because the beginning of next week's lesson he'll begin by basically saying, I'd love to tell you more about these next half a dozen individuals, but don't have time. So you won't have to hear about any specific individuals, but we will cover specific instances. So Hebrews 11, 17 through 31, more stories of faith. Could somebody read 17 through 22?
By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones.
We're in that story. Well, we begin with the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. Sometimes it's the title of it is the binding of Isaac, where he's bound on the altar and meant to be lifted up as a sacrifice. The only two places in the New Testament where this story is mentioned is here and in James 2, 21 through 23, and they're both mentioned for the same reason. These are demonstrations of faith in action, or examples of faith in action. And the purpose was a demonstration of Abraham's trust in God, absolutely, and also in the promises of God. It's an unusual thing that the person and the promises of God are both inextricably bound together. You can't separate the two. Abraham cannot just simply trust God, but not trust in the promises that God has given. So it's not as though he could take his son, his only son, or as the author of Hebrews says, his only begotten son, and that term is used for more than one reason. There's going to be these little Christological instances or inferences that if it sounds like a New Testament author is writing about Old Testament stuff, that's because a New Testament author who's very Christological in his emphasis is writing New Testament stuff. But Abraham can't just simply trust God and not trust those promises as well. He's demonstrating by recalling the story. Now, we're familiar with the story, and the congregation would be very familiar with this story as well. This is part and parcel with who and what they were. They know all of the details of the stories of Abraham, being a good Jewish congregation that they were. They would know exactly what the author of Hebrews is talking about. But he's demonstrating the fact that Abraham doesn't just simply trust God, he trusts the promises of God. And the way that he talks about this instance, this story, the way he reflects upon it, demonstrates that Abraham trusts God and trusts the promises of God. He doesn't know how it's all going to play out. He doesn't know the details. He's just entering into this situation fully trusting not just God, but in the promises. So it's not as though this is an expression of Abraham declaring, Lord, I trust you, but I have no idea how you're going to bring about these promises, and I don't really trust them because it sounds like you're wanting me to kill my son, my only begotten son, and the promise can't be fulfilled, so let's talk about this. He enters into this situation simply fully trusting in God. Isaac was his only offspring, and now he had to be sacrificed. And this begs the question, how does God reconcile the fulfillment of this promise with the command that he's just given? God has promised Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, and he will have children and descendants, and you will have children and descendants through this one son. And now he's asking him to sacrifice that one son. And it begs the question, how does one have the promise fulfilled and this commandment fulfilled? The commandment to sacrifice his son. And if you read the story in Genesis 22, we can speculate and can read into the text how Abraham felt and what was going through his mind, but that doesn't come out of the text. What comes out of the text is that he just enters into this situation faithfully trusting in God, trusting in the promises, and assuming that God's going to work all this out. He just doesn't know how. So he's walking into this blindly. It's so easy for us to look back, and probably for this congregation to look back and say, well, we know how God's going to do it. He's going to stop Abraham right before he sacrificed the son. But you need to remember in the story, Abraham doesn't know a thing except take your son up, bind him to the wood, sacrifice him. That's all he knows. And the way it plays out in the story is that Abraham trusts God in all of this. In verse 19, the author states that Abraham believed in God's ability to raise the dead, and that might sound like he's reading something into the text that isn't there. But in Genesis 22:5, it states, quote, where Abraham is speaking to his servants, "The boy and I will go on there and worship, and we will come back to you." And that doesn't, you may wonder, well, where's the whole resurrection from the dead thing? It is inferred. I don't know how God is going to do this, but I know that Isaac and I are going to go, and he will be sacrificed, and we will come back, because apparently, since God can raise people from the dead, he's going to raise my son from the dead, because I know and trust his promise that what God has said in regard to my son and my descendants is going to happen.
Can I be cynical?
Sure. We've come to expect that. No, I'm just kidding.
Could Abraham have said that just as a cover because he hasn't told Isaac that he's going to kill him?
It could be that too. He may be trying to be a really good father. Isaac may not know it until Abraham picks him up and puts him on the altar. And I'm sure Isaac has seen his father put animals on the altar before. And it may be he's waiting until he absolutely has to do it to let him know. But the author of Hebrew is probably inferring from that Abraham is trusting in God. So I don't think you're being cynical. I think that may be part of it. There's probably several things going on, and one of them may be I'm holding off in telling my servants what I'm being asked to do, because remember, Abraham is a follower of Yahweh, and Yahweh does not ask for human sacrifice. That may be part of Abraham's struggle too. How are we going to sacrifice a human being to the God who doesn't accept human sacrifice? That may be going through his mind, as well as, how am I going to tell my son, oh, I'm going to sacrifice you?
How did he tie his son up?
He probably bound his arms and his legs.
How did he catch him to sign?
Well, remember,
the breath when he was picking him up. Hey, we're just now.
Remember, this is before World War II, so children were more obedient than they are now. I was born after World War II, and believe me, I did not run from my mother.
Well, I was also thinking that if God told Abraham that, really directly, that's what got him to go, that you were going to have a child, you're going to be the father of many nations. Probably he believed that God was being truthful when he was telling him to sacrifice his son. But it must have been like a vacuum. It's like nothing else, like tunnel vision from him to God and his mind. And I don't know. I think when you're under that sort of directive, you're going to do it regardless of what
and remember,
anyone else thinks.
This is an encapsulation of a story that really isn't drawn out and long. We don't know how Abraham felt the night before when he knew he was going to have to sacrifice his only son that he waited a century for. The son that God promised him, that now God was asking back. So how he felt and the process that he's going through, what we get from the text is that he seems to be trusting in God, knowing that God has told him that Isaac is the child of his promise, but also that he's now being asked to sacrifice this child. The author of Hebrews is gleaning from this phrasing in verse 5 of Genesis 22 that we're both going to go and we're both going to come back. He knows that's going to happen. He knows the promise is going to be fulfilled. He just doesn't know how. And it may be that Abraham is, at least according to the author of Hebrews, may be saying, apparently he's going to raise my son from the dead. But I'm going to sacrifice my son because God has commanded me to do this. But I also know that he is the child of promise that is promised to me. And so somehow, some way, he's going to be that child of promise. The promise is not going to end up on the hill, on that altar. The point is, ultimately, that the author of Hebrews is getting across to us is that Abraham trusts God absolutely. He doesn't know how it's going to play out. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't have the details. God doesn't come alongside him and say, just get the kid on the altar, raise the knife, and I'll take care of it from there. I'll stop your... He doesn't know what God's going to do, but he knows that God is going to do it. And so he seems to just simply trust God. This is not an easy thing that Abraham is going through. And we're familiar with the story and all this, the feelings that he must have had and all those sorts of things. But what the author of Hebrews is gleaning from the text is that he trusted God in his relationship with him, and he trusted God in the promise that he had made, not just to give him a son, but remember, he took him out in Genesis 15, and God and Abraham are staring at the night sky, and he tells Abraham, count the stars. You can't do it. That's how many descendants you'll have. And he knows, Abraham knows that's going to happen. He just doesn't know how. There's a little phrase at the end of verse 19 about, Scott, what was your translation? About a figure. The word figure was used.
This is verse 19?
Yes, at the end of verse 19.
A figurative sense.
A figurative sense. My translation has as a type, T-Y-P-E. Does anybody have something other than a figurative sense, a type?
Well, it's figuratively speaking.
Figuratively speaking. Most translations are type. This is an unusual thing to simply tack on because there is nothing figurative about what Abraham did with Isaac, but the author of Hebrews is making a connection that is easy for us to make. It wasn't necessarily that easy for Abraham to make. What the author of Hebrews is meaning is that this is a typology or an inference more than just a figurative expression of the resurrection of Jesus. That what's taking place here is a parallel, not an exact expression of, but a close parallel to Christ's resurrection.
I was just thinking about the figuratively speaking. I wish more of our text as a whole in the Bible would say that on specific points, figuratively speaking.
It would be nice to know.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus usually gives us those indications when he starts telling a story. And we take them literally. And so we have to be kind of careful with it. Jesus often says the kingdom of heaven is like, which is his way of saying, don't take this literally, folks. It's a figurative expression. We have a tendency to take it figuratively, or literally. But you're right. It would be nice if there was, you know how in the King James, the words of Jesus are in red, if the figurative stuff were in blue or green or something like that.
Didn't Abraham come out of a culture where they did do human sacrifice?
Oh yeah, that was very common
So
in his day and
maybe
age.
he knew in his forward belief that they did that, and so maybe that wasn't such an odd thing, but he still did. Well, I don't know.
It may have been something he could have been culturally receptive to, but this was still his only son. And so it would have been shocking in that sense. It also would have been shocking in the sense of the God who said, I'm going to give you a son, has given him a son, and now that God says, I'm going to take that son from you. But we're drawing Christological parallels, or the author of Hebrews is. And yeah, it is nice that he's giving us that indication, saying, oh, by the way, this is a typology, or it's a figurative expression of a son being sacrificed. But obviously, it's not the same type of sacrifice. It's not the same type of demand. It's not even the same type of results. Isaac is not sacrificed. Jesus was. Who willingly, now, and we don't know, like Tim was saying, we don't know if Isaac was running off and Abraham had to chase him down and tie him up. However that happened, Jesus willingly went to the cross. He was a willing sacrifice. So we have to be careful with those typologies. But the author of Hebrews is making an inference. He's telling his congregation, does this sound familiar? A son who is sacrificed for a greater cause and an expression of faith? And the congregation is supposed to say, oh yeah, Jesus. Yeah, we can see something, a connection between Jesus' sacrifice and his resurrection as well. And one of the commentaries I was reading through noted that this could be an echo of John 8:56, where Jesus says, quote, your father Abraham rejoiced that he was to see my day. He saw it and was glad, which is a strange thing for Jesus to say. He saw Jesus' day and was glad. And it may be kind of a telescoping event that Abraham can see something bigger and better beyond himself, his son, his descendants, that God is doing. That Jesus may be saying, Abraham was able to get a little snapshot of the big picture, which went way beyond him, way beyond the land, way beyond his descendants. Something more than just the nation of Israel. Abraham knew there was something bigger going on. He saw it and he rejoiced in it. That Abraham recognized that he was part of that big picture of the ultimate promise, which was more than just the promise of a son. Maybe, maybe not. Then in verse 20, we get into the patriarchs. Isaac trusted God in giving blessings to his son, namely Jacob, to fulfill the promise. And in verse 21, Jacob trusted God at the end of his life by blessing the sons of Joseph and continuing the promise. And in verse 22, Joseph trusted God at the end of his life to return his body to the land where his forefathers were to be buried, or where they had been buried, through the Exodus. So he's giving a reference to the Exodus event and the continuation of that promise. One of the things I noticed in this that, I've said this before, the questions I come up with are never answered in my commentaries. And I think, well, this is, I'm sure this is going to be in the commentary. These seem to be end-of-life things, not all throughout chapter 11, but near the end of Abraham's life, he was asked to sacrifice his son. And then near the end of Isaac's life, he gave a blessing to his sons. And near the end of Jacob's life, he gave a blessing to the sons of Joseph. And then near the end of Joseph's life, he asked that his bones be buried in the promised land. And I don't think that means you have to wait until you're almost dead before you can give a full expression of living by faith. But what it drew to my mind was that there's a sense of time, that it may not come quickly. These are little bullet points of expression. By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. These things happened. These people did these things. But it took time. A long period of time. How long did Abraham have to wait? How long did Isaac wait? And Jacob and Joseph? How long did Israel have to wait until the Messiah came? Centuries upon centuries. And so what I do see in this is not, well, when you're old and gray like me, then you can start giving expression to living by faith. I think it has the sense of there's going to be long periods of time, sometimes, when we have to wait and be trusting and faithful and trust God in His time for these things to take place, so that it's not a matter of, Lord, I trust you, give me now, whatever it is. I trust that you'll give me this now. So let's go. I'm ready, you're ready, we're all ready, let's go. It may take weeks, months, years before whatever it is that God is going to do with us. Which is a word, that can cut both ways. That may be a matter of how long am I going to have to wait. but it is also a positive word in the sense that God is going to be with us throughout those long periods of time. God's waiting with us. We're not waiting by ourselves. Could somebody read verses 23 through 28?
By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. By faith, is that 28?
28,
Okay.
yeah. This is not the first time the author of Hebrews has mentioned Moses. He's mentioned back in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, where he talks about the faithfulness of Moses, but now he picks up with him again, and he begins telling us about his life, starting actually with his parents and their faith. He begins with the foundational expression of his parents' faith, that they trusted God enough that they hid their child for 3 months. And there's an unusual phrase in there, because they saw he was a beautiful child. That's a strange way of phrasing something that really means exceptional. Something's different about this child. His parents recognize that, and the inference is that there's some sort of spiritual insight. And it's not a matter of, look how special we are that we brought this special child into the world. The implication is, God has given us something here that's different and exceptional. We better take care of it and trust in God to take care of us and this child. So from the time that Moses was born, there was a sense of faith being expressed even before his ministry began. And then once grown, Moses chooses to identify with God's people and their struggles rather than the passing pleasures that come from sin. And so he trusted in God in that situation, in those circumstances. And then in verse 26, where am I at here? This is a strange thing to suddenly throw in there. Considering the reproach of Christ, most translations have Christ. We need to be careful with that. The author of Hebrews, he does mean Jesus, but Moses would not think of Jesus. He would think of the Messiah, not knowing who he was, when he would come about, and what circumstances were. But this seems to mean that Moses was aligning himself with God's future Messiah and his struggles and the disgrace that he would receive as a result of being faithful and following God, which are often the results of God's faithful following God in this world. That often takes place. As we, especially next week, will see what it means to live by faith. It's not always an easy situation. It's not always God translating us up into heaven like Enoch, or the fact that we do this tremendous thing of building a massive, large boat and saving human life and animal life. Or it may not be leading the children of Israel through the Exodus, through the desert, to bring them into the promised land. It may not be that tremendous and grateful thing, or great thing that takes place. Often following God means struggling. And Moses was willing to do that. He trusted God enough that he was willing to align himself with the children of Israel rather than to align himself with Pharaoh's daughter, the house of Pharaoh, in order to follow the example of the Messiah, his reproach and disgrace that he would experience, so that the fulfillment of the promise would be somewhere in the future. And then finally, by faith, Moses left Egypt to trust God's leading. He persevered because he saw and followed the unseen God rather than the seen king. You can see Pharaoh, but you couldn't necessarily see God. Now I know you're probably thinking, Mount Sinai, burning bush. God was there, but he didn't really actually see God. As a matter of fact, God tells Moses, you can't actually see me. I walked by you at one point and you can see, and you need to stick your face in the cleft of the rock. And once I pass by, look, you can see my passing glory, but you still can't see me. So Moses never actually sees God, but he trusts in the God that he can't see rather than the king or the man that he can't see. And then finally, by faith, Moses led Israel into Passover worship. And here we have another typology of Jesus in the very obvious phrasing, the sprinkling of the blood. That should not recall to the minds of his congregation just simply the events in Exodus. That should also recall to their minds Christ on the cross and the fact that he shed his blood and that he was the sacrificial lamb. It's a parallel that is often made throughout the New Testament and has been for the last 2,000 years. In Christian history, it's a very common typology that's often made. But at the same time, there's the historical reality that God preserved Israel for those who trusted God and followed the command to put the blood on the doorposts so that the death angel would pass them by. That still took trust. And it seems like such a simple thing, but no doubt there were those that did not do that. So we see in this part of the life and the ministry of Moses another example of someone who was faithful in their trusting of God, faithful in their obedience, and not always knowing exactly where it was going. Once again, we have the story of Moses really compressed here. We don't have his years in the Sinai desert. Does anybody remember how many years he spent in the Sinai desert tending the sheep and the goats of his father-in-law Jethro?
40 years?
40 years. 40 years of his life tending sheep. 40 years. Now stop and think about that. God's not really doing any of the big flashy stuff. I mean, we're not parting the Red Sea. We're not performing the miracles and the plagues. And it's 40 years of just tending sheep. Year after year after year. Now, I have no doubt that God was working on him. And probably, and this has often been referred to by scholars, that what he was preparing Moses to do was to tend God's flock. That is, the children of Israel. Tending sheep. Sheep are not the smartest things on the planet. And you got to really work to get them from point A to point B. You always have to protect them. You always have to lead them to where they need to go as far as food and water is concerned. They don't necessarily know this, and that's pretty much a good description of the children of Israel throughout the entire Old Testament. They were like sheep gone astray that always needed a shepherd to guide and direct them because they would always just sort of wander off and start following other gods. But Moses' life was a long, drawn-out process. It wasn't just these nice little snippets of God did this, and God did this, and Moses did this, and Moses responded like this. There's a long process involved in this. And it demands trust and faith day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. You can't tell me Moses at one point while tending sheep in 40 years didn't say, is this what it was all about? Is this it? God has saved me and kept me. I'm sure he was told the stories of what it was like when he was first born and what his parents had to do to preserve his life. And I was meant to be a shepherd. Anybody can be a shepherd. What's the big deal? But still trusting in God and still following and being guided and directed by God. Could somebody read verses 29 through 31?
By faith they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through the dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down, and after they had been encircled for 7 days, by faith that Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace.
Now the author of Hebrews moves to the Exodus and the conquest in a very tight-knit fashion. And again, faith in action is the trusting of Israel to pass through the Red Sea, for God to hold back the waters, And also to make sure, I mean, what's the point of parting the Red Sea and letting them go through if God is then going to let the Egyptian army go through? Somehow God's going to take care of this. Save us, destroy them. But they don't know that in the midst of it. And if you're talking about moving tens of thousands of people and their possessions and their sheep and cattle and donkeys and whatever else they have, that takes time. So you read the story and you think, well, God parted the waters, they pass through, and they get to the other side, and it didn't really take that long. Even when you watch Cecil B. DeMille's multi-day event of the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, it's very compressed. That scene is very compressed. Where they part the Red Sea, where the image of the parting of the Red Sea, it took time, and it took trust that I don't know what's going to happen, but God's going to get us through, and then somehow He's going to take care of the Egyptian army, but I don't really know how. So once again, that was an expression of faith. And then the same thing with the events of the collapsing of the walls of Jericho. How many days did Israel go around the city of Jericho?
7.
7 days. You can't tell me by day 3 somebody wasn't, remember, these are the children of Israel, they're known for their grumbling, that somewhere around day 3 somebody didn't say, are we doing this again? Why can't God just go and do it? What's the deal? What's the point? 7 days of getting everybody together, up in the morning. I'm sure there were plenty of people that preferred to have their morning coffee before they went out and walked around the city of Jericho. It took time. Day after day after day. And I'm sure people are checking their watches and shrugging their shoulders and wondering what's going on. It took faith to simply trust. I know what God has said He's going to do, and I'm assuming He's going to do it, and I hope He does it. Although I have no doubt people said, I hope He does it a little bit sooner than it seems to be taking place. But that took trust that God ultimately is going to take care of the situation. And then in the final verse, in verse 31, what is unusual about this person of faith, especially compared to the previous ones we talked about this week and last week and the week before? What's unusual about this person of faith?
She's not Hebrew.
She is not a Hebrew. I thought it was just a list of good Hebrews. So that's problem number 1. What's problem number 2? What's wrong with this individual?
She's a harlot.
She's a harlot. That's nice biblical language for she's a prostitute. This is not, she's not the right type of person ethnically or morally. She's not a Hebrew, and she is a prostitute. And then there's problem number 3. And it's there in the verse, but it's not there. I guess that's not a good way of saying it.
Betrayed her own people.
Well, she betrayed her own people, but as far as her being a person,
A woman.
she's a woman. And have you noticed, we've had no other women in this one. Now, I know Sarah was mentioned in last week's passage, but not as a woman of faith. She was mentioned as an ancillary or tack-on to demonstrate Abraham was completely unable to have children. Not only was he physically unable to have children, but even his wife was barren. She's just kind of mentioned in passing. This is the first and only woman mentioned in this chapter as a person of faith. And she is not a Hebrew, and she is a prostitute. She's all wrong. But what makes her now a person who has become a part of the promise is faith, which means only Hebrews need not apply. Only morally sound individuals need not apply. Only men need not apply. Those who choose to become a part of the promise that God has made through Christ includes anybody and everybody who comes by faith. I think Rahab the harlot is sort of an exclamation point tacked on right at the end, because you're reading through this and thinking, oh yeah, Noah, Noah would, and Enoch, definitely. Abraham, absolutely. And the other patriarchs, Isaac, Joseph, Jacob, Moses, of course. And you notice who isn't mentioned in the conquest? Joshua. But Rahab the harlot, a woman, a prostitute, and not a Hebrew. In Joshua 2:9, she stated, I know the Lord has given this land to you. She's trusting in the fact that what God was doing through Israel and for them, she believed it was going to happen. But 2 verses later, in verse 11, she states, for Yahweh, your God, is He who is God in heaven above and on earth. So she is more than just escaping destruction. She's becoming a part of the promise by faith. She believes. It's not just, I've heard the rumor of you people destroying Jericho and other things like this, and it sounds really, or other cities, and it sounds really serious. So your God seems to be really scary, so I'm coming over on your side to save my skin. It's not escaping destruction, it's becoming a part of the promise.
Well, also allows her to get out of the stigma of what she is. She probably didn't like that a lot. People were prostitutes not really because they wanted to, but they had no other way to make a living. I guess they liked it, but at the same time, but I would think it would be just like Jesus forgave Mary Magdalene. Now some people say she's a prostitute, some people, that's not clear, I guess, but they said she was. I don't know. But maybe that was her way also.
Well, and Jesus saving the woman who was caught in adultery and then forgiving her. So she's escaping a lot of things, not just a destructive city or a city that's going to be destroyed. She's escaping a destructive lifestyle. She's becoming now a real Hebrew by faith, not by biology, by becoming a part of the promise and inheriting that promise, joining with it. Since those mentioned above are in the Bible, is their faith in God greater than our faith?
Maybe.
I wasn't expecting that. We got a maybe. We got a yes, a no. Their faith greater than ours?
We may not have been tested quite as hard as they are. So we may not have had to put it on the line quite as much as they did.
I think my theology class is over here because I'm getting these baby answers. I don't have people of faith. I have theologians instead. Is their faith greater than ours? Maybe. Yes. No.
Are there degrees of faith?
Well, that wasn't really the question. Once again, we have a theologian. Y'all are really skirting around this, aren't you?
Well, I'm sure they have the distractions like we do now and different distractions, but it seems like they didn't know a lot of what else was going on in the world other than what they knew. They had no way of having national news and whatever, but maybe they were able to, it's just me thinking, maybe they were able to be more concentrated in their belief, and they see miracles, they believe miracles more than we do now because we see a lot of things like that around us, but I don't know. They had less of a, just, I guess, a preoccupation with the rest of the world. They had the Canaanites and stuff.
So, is that a maybe?
Maybe.
This is the maybe side.
Well, apparently so.
Thoughts just passed through my mind.
I'd say it's like a lot of people until you're put in a situation you don't know.
Okay.
People going to war, some of them could stand up and charge and some of them couldn't. And I'm sure in the Bible, God may have had asked people to do something, they didn't do it all through, but we hear about those who did. So I'm sure just like now it was the same there then. Some people could pass the test and some people couldn't.
Okay. So that sounds like a maybe too.
No, it's some are and some aren't. It's not maybe. It's just some are and some aren't.
Okay. So is their faith greater than ours?
You tell us. You're the teacher.
Some are equal.
Some are equal and some are less and more equal than others.
Isn't faith given by God?
Faith is given by God,
So it's the same.
so it is the same. I think the answer is their faith is not greater than ours. We have a tendency to make their faith greater than ours. Oh, if I could just have the faith of Paul. Well, we do. I do. I think we do. I'm pretty sure we do. I know we do. There's nothing extraordinary about these people in the Bible. I know that's a bit of a shock because we look to these examples. That's why the author of Hebrews is creating this list of individuals to give them examples. But part of that means these were just people like us. They're fairly ordinary. We haven't looked at everybody yet. As a matter of fact, if you just look at at verse 32, there's a list of names that are given there. 4 of them are judges, and then David and Samuel are mentioned. So if you got to stick David in there in order to demonstrate how ordinary and sometimes less than ordinary these individuals were. Noah trusted God completely and he built the ark. And then afterwards, when it was all over with, he got drunk and lay naked in front of his family. Abel was murdered. Moses was a murderer. Remember, he killed an Egyptian. Jacob was the deceiver, the younger son that was grasping onto his brother's heel as he was born. And he used deception and manipulation to get his way quite often, which is not always really trusting in God. Abraham told lies about his wife. Isaac told lies about his wife. David, who is often described as a man after God's own heart, was not only an adulterer, he got another man's wife pregnant and then had that man killed.
Well, it seems like people were very brutal back then. I mean, you didn't kill people nicely.
You mean like in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like people were very brutal back then.
People are just as brutal today.
Yeah.
I mean, the harshness hasn't really toned down, to be perfectly honest. There's much more hand-to-hand combat back then, and you often would see your enemies up close. But brutality is kind of like sin. It's something that's never smoothed over and gotten any easier. I heard an interview recently with a gentleman who still teaches, I think, at Houston Baptist University. And he's a theologian, that's problem number 1. And he said when he writes books and articles, he sticks ST, saint, in front of people's names like Paul. And he said, I notice whenever certain denominations publish my works, they keep the ST in front of there. St. Paul, and St. Paul said this, and St. Paul did that. But when the more evangelical publishing firms publish his works, they drop the ST. And he doesn't like that because he thinks, and he has said, that the title saint should be in front of names like Paul and Augustine of Hippo, because he believes that they are more saintly and pious than us. Maybe I'm just a good egalitarian American or a good leveling evangelical, or however you want to term it. I don't think so. I think it's because when you really look at the examples of individuals in both the Old and the New Testament, they're not extraordinary people. They are often placed in extraordinary circumstances, and they're trusting in an extraordinary God. But these people are not really that spectacular when you start looking at all the details of their lives as if they were perfect and wonderful. What we really see are people that are ultimately trusting in God, and it's usually a matter of, I have no idea what's about to happen. God has asked me to take my only son and sacrifice him. Somehow God's going to work this out, but I don't know how. But Abraham is still trusting in God. And even when these individuals, kind of like with David and the whole thing with Uriah the Hittite and his wife and all of that sort of stuff takes place, it doesn't seem like he's always trusting in God. So we need to be careful about making that comparison. You know, if I were really super pious, I'd have a write-up in the Bible. Well, no, there's all sorts of problems with that type of notion. The Apostle Paul, I think if he were here and we were to ask him, would you prefer ST period be in front of your name, St. Paul? I think he would say, no, absolutely not. I persecuted the church. Remember in Acts when Stephen's getting ready to be stoned and the men that are getting ready to throw rocks and kill him, they hand their cloaks to Saul of Tarsus. He's standing there watching this follower of Christ being killed, being martyred. He probably, we don't know this, he doesn't record it, Paul probably heard Jesus speak, at least at some point in Jerusalem. He was probably aware of him. And I think Paul would say, I had a chance and an opportunity, but it wasn't until much later. One lately born, One who basically, I think Paul would probably say, I've just barely slipped into the kingdom of God. I just slipped in, I just made it in being an apostle. I don't think Paul would say, please put saint in front of my name because I'm just so saintly. I think he would say, you need to tone it down in regards to me. I think you need to look at Christ. Look to Christ and his example. Not everyone can be an Abraham. Not everyone can be a Moses. But God doesn't need another Abraham, and God doesn't need another Moses. God needs us to be who God wants us to be in trusting him. And that means he needs us to be trusting him every day when we're shepherding for 40 years, whatever that may be in our lives, or where we are in those extraordinary circumstances when a miracle is taking place. We need to trust God when we have a good feel for what's going to happen and the direction we're going, and we need to trust God whenever we don't have a clue, because the people in the Bible don't always have a clue. They just simply have to trust God. So we need to remember that when the phrase, I trust God, is made, there is no but that comes after. I trust God, comma, but there is no but. God wants us to trust him. God wants us to have faith in him and to live by faith. And that means we rarely have these type of cataclysmic events in our lives. Trusting in God and having faith in God usually means the 40 years of shepherding and the long journey going from Ur of the Chaldees up through the Arabian desert, down into the Palestine, the Holy Land, and then again down into Egypt. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, just trusting God on a daily basis. That's often the miracle, more than anything else. There was just a few last little bullet points that I wanted to make. One of the commentaries noted a nice long list of what is entailed in faith. Faith involves action. All of these individuals did not sit around and contemplate faith. I'm a person of great faith. I can think it and I can feel it. Their faith was seen, as if God was telling them, come on, let's go. We got things to do. Demonstrate your relationship with me. Faith is often in response to an unseen God. They don't see God. God is not literally walking next to them like a human being or a person is. It might involve miracles, but it does involve ordinary people. That's a tremendous testimony to us. It involves people who trip and fall and mess up. So there's hope for us. That's a good word. Faith works in a variety of ways. Sacrifice, build a boat, move your family, bless children, do all sorts of things. There is no formula for how faith works out, so that you know. Faith has different outcomes. Abel was killed. Enoch, it's interesting, those two are jammed together. Enoch was murdered. He lived a life by faith, and in response to that, he was murdered. Enoch lived a life of faith. In response to that, he never died. He was just assumed up into heaven. So we have no idea what the outcome is going to be. It's not a matter of, well, I know I'm following God because I see the same exact outcome in my life that I've seen in somebody here or somebody that I've known or a parent or a grandparent. Faith often involves time. I've already mentioned this. It's a long, drawn-out process. It could be immediate. I'm not saying that you pray something in the morning and bang, there it is that afternoon.
But the two on the cross immediately.
It could be, but remember, it's often a long, drawn-out process. Hold on, wait, trust in God, don't let go. And faith is rewarded. And we looked through this passage that we've looked at already, and the promise is given, but not the fulfillment of the promise. That was Jesus. But even then, we don't have the full expression of that promise. We're still waiting for the promise to ultimately be fulfilled. But the promise will be fulfilled, that we will be with God in Christ, in the heavenly sanctuary, with him. Not yet, but will be. Any final questions or parting shots or comments? Well, we'll finish chapter 11 next week. We'll look at 32 through 40. And a few other names will be mentioned, but what will be mentioned after that are things that often happen as a result of following God in this world. And it's not always pleasant. It doesn't sound like a list of things that you would want to read and it would encourage you to join the Christian faith. But it's part of that process of living by faith. Let me go ahead and close this in prayer. Father, we are thankful for this word that we have received today, that we have seen in those that were faithful to you, their lives lived out in extraordinary ways, although they are extraordinary people. They are followers of an extraordinary God. And it's what you have done in their lives. It's the faith that you have given them. And it's your leading in their lives that has changed them and made the difference. And they have trusted that. They have trusted you. They've trusted your promises. They've trusted completely. Help us to remember that. We will trip and fall. We will make mistakes. We will turn away. But we always know that you are there leading us. You are always there with us, even when we don't recognize you're there. Be with us as we enter into a time of worship. Help us to continue to hear your word, to take it into our lives, and to continue to trust and live by faith. For it's in Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, everyone.